This is Brock Shinen, and today we're going to be talking about parodies in the church. Now, this is sort of in conjunction with the training that I did on fair use, and really in order to understand the context for parodies and how they work in the church context, I think it'd be helpful for you to watch the training on fair use. So make sure you find that. And if you are not sure where to find that, send me an email, brock@shininlaw.com. You'll see the contact information at the end of this training, but send me an email if you can't find that fair use training. But I would definitely suggest that you watch it before you watch this parody training. So the next thing I want to talk about is that this training is not legal advice. Yes, I am an attorney, but no, I am not looking at any specific facts that relate to your situation. I'm not applying specific facts and specific law. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm giving general information. It's for informational purposes. And if you if you were in a situation where you really felt like, hey, we want to understand our rights as it relates to parodies, or we want to understand what we're going through in this church or this ministry context, we'd really have to engage in that legal representation, that legal relationship for me to be able to apply the law to your specific facts. So I just want it clear that this training is for informational purposes only. So let's move on. All right, you're watching this training on parodies in the church, and as you most likely know, I've also completed a training for fair use in the church. I wanted to interject a quick slide and talk real quickly about this is the second version of this training. So in version 1 of the parody training, I actually included clips, musical clips that were located on YouTube to actually demonstrate how you walk through the process of fair use analysis, parody analysis. And what happened is after I posted those on YouTube, I received takedowns on those. And it's ironic because of the topic that we are discussing. And I think this is very important for churches in particular to pay attention to, because even if fair use applies or what you're creating is a parody under U.S. law, you may still get your content taken down. And so what I did is, this is the second version, like I said, of this parody training. I removed all of the musical content and instead just included slides with directions for how you can access that same musical content on YouTube on your own. So basically, you'll see a couple of spots where it may feel a little choppy in this training, and that's because I removed video content, musical content, and instead replaced it with slides. And I'm giving you instructions of, okay, go onto YouTube, look up this song, listen to the song, and then come back to this training. So you'll see a few different spots where that's happening in this video. The other thing that I've done is, because of the takedown, I created a separate training that is called Fair Use versus Takedowns. And in that training, I kind of walk through an explanation of, okay, you've created some sort of content and you believe that fair use applies. Maybe it's a parody, or maybe it's not a parody, but still it falls under fair use. You post that content somewhere, or you are making that content available somewhere, and it gets taken down. This is sort of just focusing in on online activities, and because my example took place on YouTube, I'm actually just building the training around YouTube. But the same logic applies on any website, but we're going to focus in on YouTube just to be able to communicate what happens when your content is legal. You are using somebody else's copyrights without permission because fair use would apply. Your analysis it determines that fair use applies, but you are still forced to take the content offline. What does that look like? What's the process like? Why does that happen? And what can you do about it? That's what that other training is about. So after you watch this at some point, just do on my channel, Brock Shinen channel on YouTube, search for the Fair Use versus Takedowns video and watch that. I think it's going to be very instructive for you if you are dealing with, you're hoping to leverage fair use and parodies in your favor. Now, parodies are actually sort of a subset of fair use. And once you take the fair use training, you'll realize that fair use is a defense. So I'm not going to go back through the entire fair use training. Instead, what I'm going to do is just kind of highlight some of the important points for you to remember. But parodies kind of fit within the rubric, with it, sort of under the umbrella of fair use. And it's important to realize that fair use, or to remind yourself, fair use is a defense to a claim for infringement. It's not the same as permission. It's not some sort of blanket, yes, you're okay to do this just because it was funny. That's not what a parody is. And even if it was, it's still a defense, meaning you've probably been sued, or there's a threat of a lawsuit, and your argument is, well, wait a second, you can't sue me, or if you do, you won't win because of parody. So remember, there's a couple of highlights here, notwithstanding the provisions of Section 106 and 106A. What those are is in the Copyright Act, U.S. copyright law. The sections 106 and 106A talk about a copyright owner's exclusive rights. And the second point, of course, is that it requires critical analysis, meaning you can't just assume because something is funny, or it's making fun of, or there's satire involved. You cannot assume that parody applies, or that fair use applies, actually. Each scenario requires a very critical analysis, applying what you know about parodies, about fair use. So it is a critical analysis. And as I said, each case should be taken on a case-by-case basis, meaning it's one thing to sort of highlight what parody is, how it fits into the bucket of fair use, but it's another thing to apply sort of a blanket outcome that, well, hey, if and this is very common in churches. If we're a nonprofit, we're a 501c3, we're not selling anything, we used it in the church service, all of that kind of stuff. Therefore, the blanket outcome is that it's a fair use or it's a parody. And that's actually not generally true, or it's not specifically true most of the time. You're going to have to look at this scenario on a case-by-case basis, even when you're doing a lot of the same things each time. There may be other factors that come into play where you have to assess those factors and how they play into your understanding of parodies. The other thing is that when you apply parodies, because fair use is a defense to a claim of infringement, there's this ongoing risk that you could be wrong. A judge might disagree with you, and even if a judge doesn't disagree, keep in mind that people can sue without winning their case. Now, I know that sounds intuitive. Of course they can, Brock. People sue in order to get a case before a judge or a jury. But remember that once you are sued, it's your job to defend yourself. And so if you receive a cease and desist letter or something like that, and you're dragged into court, remember you're going to have to spend time and energy and money defending that case, even if the ultimate outcome is that you're successful. What that means is the ongoing risk it relates to your time, your energy, the money that you invest in fighting this. And that's one of the reasons why can be a trap for churches, is because if you get sued, you're going to have to spend a lot of money defending it, even if you're right. And there are times when copyright owners know that churches do not have deep pockets. By and large, they don't have deep pockets. So they're copyright owners that feel, well, hey, if I just sue them, they're going to have to settle. They're going to have to pay something. And that could be a practice that is employed to get money out of churches that they actually wouldn't have had to have paid if a judge would have determined that, yes, parity applies. So there is an inherent risk. And the possibility of inconsistent outcomes, this final point here, I just want to kind of lay out that, what we see, the United States and the judicial system is broken up, all these different courts and different territories, and then by state, and then there's appellate districts and all this sort of thing. What happens is a judge in one court or one jurisdiction, one state, may be reviewing the exact same law as a judge in another state, for example, and those two judges might actually disagree on the outcome. We see this actually all the time in U.S. Supreme Court decisions where, this is supposed to be the supreme law of the land, and yet on a panel of judges, there are some that dissent, meaning they disagree with the majority's opinion. So There is always a possibility of inconsistent outcomes, which means that even if you had a judge rule in your favor in the past, it doesn't mean that a judge would rule in your favor again, or that another judge would rule in your favor on the same fact. So keep that in mind. So let's press on. And we talked about these are some of the risks inherent, but a quick recap on fair use, because this will apply. A lot of people are like, why are we spending time talking about fair use when we're supposed to be talking about parodies? Remember, parody fits within the realm of understanding of fair use. So quick recap, there are 4 factors that you always must weigh. The purpose and character of the use, including whether the use is commercial or is nonprofit educational. Second, the nature of the copyrighted work. Third, the amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyright work as a whole. So here we're talking about how much of the original did you use in your new work? And then finally, what's the effect on the market? Did your use supplant the market for the original? So and you'll have to do a deeper dive on those issues. If you did not watch the fair use training, I suggest you go back and do that, because you'll get a full explanation of what each of those factors looks like and how to weigh them properly. And remember, finally, it is about balance. This is not a one size fits all. This is not a, well, if it's nonprofit and people are still buying, or actually, a lot of churches say, well, hey, this is going to make more people buy the song or buy the film or watch the film, things like that. That, first of all, is probably false. But second of all, that's just mentioning 2 factors out of 4, and those weren't even accurately assessed. So remember, we're talking about balance. Now let's jump more into parody. What is the purpose of parody? Now, in fair use, we talked about these 6 areas: criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, or research. But when we're talking about parody, we tend to be focusing on criticism and comment. News reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research generally do not have the attributes of what makes a parody. So what is that exactly? Let's look at a definition. Now, if you, depending on what source you look at for your definition of parody, you may find all kinds of different examples or definitions. Here's one that I think sort of sums up what a parody actually is. It's an artistic imitation of an artist or work for comedic effect and or ridicule. Now let's hit a couple of those points that you see on the screen that are set off in white. Imitation, let's start there. Imitation is not copying. This is a very critical piece of your parody analysis. What we see a lot of times in the church is that a church or a ministry organization will just simply use an entire song, or it will use an entire book, or not even so much how much, the quantity, but it will just copy and maybe change some words. What we're seeing here is that there's an imitation. That's a fundamental piece of parodies, not a copy. And that's very critical. We will circle back to that with some examples, but hold on to that thought. Next, we're going, how much copying is okay? Only enough to conjure up the original. And when I say conjure up, we're not talking about some sort of witchcraft here. What we're talking about is how courts have defined that your mind, in looking at a parody, it needs to see only enough of the original that will make you think about the original and nothing more. Not enough to make you feel sort of like you're watching the original. So that's the conjuring up component. That's what it means there. So we've talked about definition of a parody in terms of it's an artistic imitation. How much can you imitate? How much can you copy? Only enough to conjure up the thought of the original. So where do we go now? How does comedy or ridicule fit in? Remember, comedy a lot of times, ridicule tends to fit into the purpose of comment or criticism. I mean, even if you've never sat in a comedy club, I'm sure you've seen comedy routines, even if they're, in part, whether you've seen them in the church or outside of the church. I think most of us have seen some sort of comedy routine. And if you think about it, so much of comedy relies on some form of either comment or criticism of the subject of the comedy. So, you might be hear a comedian making fun of a person in the in the audience. And so, yes, it's part of the comedy routine. Yes, it's ridicule, but really it's a comment or a criticism. And we see this in pretty much the entire spectrum of comedy, that there's an element in the purpose which is to comment or criticize the subject of the comedy or the ridicule. And that's another part of the essence of parody. So, what about satire? Satire, let's give it a quick definition. And of course, this is a paraphrase definition: shaming into improvement using comedy. Now, what you see when you use satire is satire tends to equal criticism. So that fits squarely within one of the purposes of fair use of a parody, which is criticism. That's definitely a quote unquote approved purpose for parody. And so, satire, what do we mean here? Shaming into improvement using comedy, making fun of somebody or something in the hopes that they will improve at what they're doing. So a lot of times we hear about political satire as an example. And the idea there is to shame, let's say a politician, to shame through comedy, the vehicle is comedy, but to shame them into doing a better job. We make fun of their failures. We make fun of the attributes that the politician may have in order or in hopes that that shame will somehow make them better. Whether it works or not doesn't matter. Satire, by definition, that's what it involves, and it's really a criticism. So let me now jump to what is the Supreme Court, which, we have to kind of work together with the statutes, the Copyright Act in particular, but also how the courts interpret the Copyright Act. So it's a great place to start when we're talking about parodies with the U.S. Supreme Court. And here's what the Supreme Court stated about parodies. It's the use of some elements, not all, but some elements of a prior author's composition. So their work, their song, their literary work, their film, whatever it is, some elements, not the whole thing, to create a new work, a new one. And that new one, at least in part, this is a huge piece of parody. And I would say if churches miss 99% of everything, this is probably one of the most important takeaways from this whole training on parodies, which is it comments on that author's work. So let me read that again. It's the use of some elements of a prior author's composition to create a new composition that, at least in part, comments on the original author's work. So that commentary function provides some justification for use of the older work, or the original work. This is huge in parodies. What does it mean in practice? What it means in practice is that, first of all, we should never be using an entire original. Now, by and large, I think most churches are using pieces. They'll use, maybe a couple of minutes of a song, or if it's a film, I know it's really common in churches to use films like Gladiator. A lot of the Mel Gibson films, for whatever reason, show up a lot in churches. And of course, we're not watching an hour and a half or 2 hours of film in a church. We tend to be watching, 1 to 10 minutes. And so that's great because that's some elements. It's not the entire, original film. But here's the other kicker. There's two other kickers. One's let's say a minor one, one's a major one. Here's the minor one: to create a new work. And hold on to this term. That new work should be transformative. It should transform the ideas, what's communicated in the original, in this new work. But here's the big one, and it comments on that author's work. So there has to be some relation back from your work, the churches, the ministry organizations, whatever you're putting together. There has to be some relation back to the original that you've used. This, by far, is the biggest area where churches and ministry organizations fail on an ongoing basis. So we're going to try and spend some time on this, understanding what that is. Now, let me give a quick disclaimer, and I really want to hit this point home because this training is for churches, it is for ministry organizations. The assumption is there are going to be some expectations that there won't be foul language or inappropriate things. What I've tried to do in this training is limit it as much as possible, but you may see some examples that most of us would consider inappropriate, distasteful, immoral, or worse, remember, this is a training video. It's not a promotional video. Please understand that that's the context that we're looking at this stuff. And I want to hit this point home because I feel it's important to know that this is not about showing inappropriate material. Unfortunately, so much of parody law, because parody is kind of birthed through comedy and ridicule, then a lot of that tends to be crass. I mean, that's the reality. A lot of comedy just tends to be inappropriate. And of course, of course we can find, Christian or quote unquote clean comedians, but it's difficult in the parody context to find really solid examples of parodies that I can use as a training tool that do not have some sort of inappropriate, component. So I want that out there. If this offends you, even hearing this, then you probably don't want to be the one reviewing this training. And maybe, and I mean this, in complete honesty and transparency. This training needs to be sort of, let's call it, medical perspective. This is analytical, medical. We're not getting into the emotions of, I can't believe I'm watching one of the things you'll see in this training is a portion of a 2 Live Crew video. If you don't know who that is, you soon will. And if you do know who that is, then you know why this type of disclaimer is important. So all that to say, please be prepared. You may hear or see some things. Nothing graphic, by the way, but just you may hear or see some things that you wouldn't expect in sort of a Christian training video, but it's necessary to communicate, and especially because one of the major parody cases in this country relates to the song Pretty Woman, which we are going to look at. And there's a Roy Orbison version, which most people are familiar with, and then there's a 2 Live Crew version, which not everybody's familiar with. And they are very different expressions, very different creative takes on that sort of thing. So I just want that out there. I apologize for belaboring the point, but I think it's important. So let's move on. The big parody case, I just mentioned this. This is the Pretty Woman, the Roy Orbison version versus the Pretty Woman, the 2 Live Crew version. So what we're going to do right now is actually show some clips and talk through them. That's what we're going to do. All right, so we're going to start with Roy Orbison's version of Pretty Woman, and we're not going to listen to the whole thing. And actually, let me just take a quick teaching moment. Part of the reason why we're not going to listen to the whole thing is because we are using this video under the premise of fair use. And part of fair use is we only need to use as much as necessary to communicate what we're trying to communicate. So, I could, of course, let the whole video play and then let the next video play and then we kind of walk back and forth. But I don't think that's necessary, and I do think that's a good teaching moment for you from a fair use perspective. You only need to use as much of the original as necessary. In the parody context, it's to conjure up the original. In fair use, it may be more than conjuring up, but it's a balancing act, as we've said. And so I'm going to use a portion of this just to communicate some ideas. So here we go. Okay, what I'd like you to do right now is to go to youtube.com and search Roy Orbison Pretty Woman. Rather than include the video clip of Roy Orbison's performance in this training video, what I'd like you to do is step out of this video, go watch the YouTube version of Roy Orbison's Pretty Woman, and then come back to this training. And I'll get into the details of why, actually in the first version of this training, I did include clips from Roy Orbison's version of Pretty Woman for the purpose of fair use and parody training. But in terms of the complications that come with copyright use, I opted to remove that content, that third-party content, and I'm going to have you search for it and watch it outside of this training video. So why don't you go ahead right now, hit pause on this video, go to YouTube, search for Roy Orbison Pretty Woman, watch that, and then come back to this video and we'll continue on. Okay, so we're going to stop here, and now what we're going to do is switch over to the 2 Live Crew version, and we'll see the obvious differences, and then we'll talk. You hit pause on this video again and go back to YouTube and search the number 2 Live Crew Pretty Woman. You'll listen to that version of the song and then come back to this training video. Okay, I'm going to stop it there again because I think the point was, we communicated enough on that point. I'm going to switch back to this main screen and we'll continue talking about these two. What's happening in the video we saw with Roy Orbison's Pretty Woman versus the Two Live Crew Pretty Woman. The Two Live Crew one, of course, just evolved into a completely different direction as a Roy Orbison version, but the court, when it assessed this comparison, because, well, let me give you background on the case first. Of course, there was a lawsuit against I'm sure it was against the label on the Two Live Crew side, and it was for infringement because the idea was that even if it was an exact copy, it was substantially similar. And in copyright infringement, substantial similarity is as bad as actual copying. So that was the allegation. There's substantial similarity, therefore there is copyright infringement. And the issue was not so much on whether or not there was substantial similarity. The issue was that there is no infringement because the Two Live Crew version was a parody. So again, that was their defense to the claim of infringement, so that procedurally you understand where these come from. And this went up the chain of courts, started at the trial court level, and of course, because of the outcomes at each level, there were appeals until eventually this case found its way into the United States Supreme Court, the highest court in this land. Now, the way that the U.S. Supreme Court looked at this situation was that Two Live Crew only used, well, there's a couple of different things. So remember we talked a little bit about parodies, what's the definition, and we talked about the satire, what's that? So let's go back to this definition of a parody, and that is an imitation of an artist or work for comedic effect or ridicule. And when we talk about satire, we talked about satire being shaming into improvement using comedy. Now this one, you may say, well, it's not satire, but it certainly falls within the definition of parody. So let's talk about that. Two Live Crew imitated the Roy Orbison version. Now you have to understand from an ownership perspective, the battle wasn't necessarily between Roy Orbison himself and Two Live Crew, although it did involve them in the case. But because of the way copyright ownership works in the music industry, this involved publishers and labels, and so some of the names in this case you may not recognize, but this was the substance of the case. So Two Live Crew's argument was that it was an imitation of Roy Orbison's version for comedic effect or ridicule. Now, why? Now, this case is fascinating, and I do recommend that you read it. You can Google this case, even if you could Google it so many different ways, but Two Live Crew, Pretty Woman, Supreme Court case, anything like that will get you there. But look at what the court said. Really what the court was focusing in on is that the Two Live Crew's version was a ridicule of, Roy Orbison's talking about this supposedly wholesome, clean, beautiful woman that, you wanted to meet, but there was this appropriateness in the relationship, and she was beautiful, and she was, all of these sort of positive merits. And then the Two Live Crew version, if you listen to all the lyrics, it's sort of the opposite. And it would give you the impression that we're talking about almost like, and I'm not saying that this is what they intended, but almost the emotion that's sort of conveyed is that this woman is almost like a prostitute or somebody who is not moral and has these attributes that are less than pure. And so there's that significant contrast in what Roy Orbison is singing about, or who Roy Orbison is singing about, versus who Two Live Crew is singing about. That's one of the major characteristics that the court looked at when it assessed whether or not this is a parody. And it did look at whether or not Two Live Crew used the same recording, which it didn't. It used its own recording. So there was that element, and it didn't rehash all the words. And it really did. I mean, if you listen to the riffs, like the guitar riffs and the drum, you recognize it, of course, but if you listen closely and if you were able to compare them side by side, even those are not identical. They're similar, and they conjure it up. But the Two Live Crew version, if you listen to the whole song, and it would be very instructive for you to. I just didn't want to in this training. If you're sitting in your church office and somebody walks by, I wanted to kind of think of the time and place that this training may be viewed. But in your own time, you may want to consider listening to the entire Roy Orbison version and then listening to the entire Two Live Crew version and comparing the lyrics, because you really see the difference in how the Two Live Crew version really described a different kind of woman, a different kind of scenario. And it was for the point of drawing contrast, ridiculing, being funny. And even when you can YouTube videos, interviews with Two Live Crew band members, and they'll talk to you about that they've done other parodies, and they in their interviews they've talked about how they're trying to be funny and all this different thing. All of that weighed into that this was a parody. But there's a very critical element I want to focus in on, and that is the Supreme Court talked about that there was some use of some elements of Roy Orbison's work, but there was really a new work created, and it was transformative. It commented on Roy Orbison's work by creating a contrast between the two. There's this supposedly wholesome woman in song number 1, and there's this very unwholesome woman in song number 2. And the comment is, by listening to this song that sounds like Roy Orbison's version, it's an inherent mental comment on, well, that's not who Roy was singing about. So that's how it goes hand in hand. I'm going to bring out another couple of examples, and we'll get through these a little bit quicker because this was the big one, this parody case. But we're going to go through some others just to kind of give additional context, and then we're going to round this thing out. So as with the Two Live Crew version, there may be some inappropriate materials to follow. So I'm giving you advance notice. Comparison. We're going to actually look at the song "Uptown Funk" featuring, in one instance, Bruno Mars. It's a Mark Ronson song, and in the other, We Shall See. But here goes the Mark Ronson with Bruno Mars, a little bit of that version, and then we will compare and contrast the other version. This time, I'm going to have you pause the video, go to YouTube, and search for Bruno Mars Uptown Funk. And watch that video, and then come back to this training. Okay, so what we've seen so far in this Uptown Funk, Mark Ronson, Bruno Mars, is there's a number of people, there's an environment, a context for this particular performance, and then we hear the words that we've all become familiar with because we hear this on the radio a million times a day. So now we're going to contrast this with a parody of this, and then we're going to talk through the parody elements. This is a parody version of Uptown Funk, and let's see this for a little bit. You're going to hit pause again on this training. Go to YouTube, and you're going to search Uptown Funk Parody. And pick the first one. I think it comes up. And one of the things I really want you to do is focus in on the lyrics and how the lyrics are commenting on the content itself of the original, and how that's sort of juxtaposed against what you see on screen. But pay attention to the individual lyrics and also what you see on the screen and the commentary that's taking place through the lyrics. That's a critical piece of parodies. Okay, so we're going to go back to main screen. Actually, we'll stay here for a second. Basically, what we're seeing in the contrast between the original Uptown Funk, the legitimate, we'll say, Uptown Funk, versus this one, you notice that there's actually commentary not just in the lyrics, but there's also commentary that as it relates to, or criticism rather, as it relates to the artists themselves. And this is a hallmark piece of parody. So let's break those apart and talk through them. On the lyrics side, you have this Uptown Funk, the original Mark Ronson, Bruno Mars version, and it just it's communicating this one message of whatever, girls and funk, and it's a great thing. But in this parody, what you're seeing now, I can see on my screen the lyrics. I don't believe they're going to show up in your screen, but in the lyrics, the singer is talking about what was happening at the time that funk music was in its heyday, with people doing cocaine and trying to imitate, this guy's trying to imitate Michael Jackson, and there's all this stuff going on, but there's commentary drawing a distinction, and it's a ridicule, it's a comedic distinction between this version, the parody, and the original. And the comment, when we say, well, how is it really commenting? It didn't mention Bruno Mars. It didn't mention Mark Ronson. No, the commentary, it takes place in how the parody actually treats the original. It's treating it like it's a joke. It's speaking directly to the original. In the Mark Ronson Bruno Mars version, we see the way that they're talking about even this woman and how she walks by, as opposed to in the parody version where she's ignoring them. It's the complete opposite effect. But there's a tie together with the original. The other way we're seeing this is in the parody, what we'd call an imitation of the Mark Ronson Bruno Mars version. But even with that, it's making fun of them. It's making fun of that author's work. So if we went back to recall that when we talk about parodies, it's critical to see that there's an imitation of some use of an original author's work, but there is a reference back to the original. And it could be on the authors themselves or the work itself. And in this case, it's both. We're looking at lyrics that the distinction in lyrics is making fun of the original lyrics, and it's making fun not just by the new choice of lyrics, but even by setting the context of what was actually happening in the days of funk, when funk was important. Because the Mark Ronson Bruno Mars version seems to sort of glamorize funk, and then what the parody version is like, it's a joke. Everybody was on cocaine. Everybody was, doing this and that. And if you listen to the whole parody version, you'd see that it just goes deeper and deeper into that. So ultimately, that's where the comment and criticism is happening, and at the lyric level, and then at the video level with Mark Ronson and Bruno Mars, they're supposed to be cool and hip, and then there's this whole contrast with these parody guys who are, it's a one big joke. Who's this white guy over here? Who's this guy that's dancing like Michael Jackson? It's basically the reference back to the original, the legitimate version, and making fun of it by saying, what's the point of having these guys that are just randomly standing around on a street corner? It's not even a street corner, it's a movie set. So it's completely making fun of what Mark Ronson and Bruno Mars did in the original. It's poking fun at that. So let's move on. We're going to switch gears a little bit, but let me get back on screen with you. Final example we are going to look at, and you can YouTube all of these videos to kind of immerse yourself a little bit deeper into this training, but this last one we're going to look at is what is called a church parody, and it's titled The Wrong Worship. You can find it on YouTube, and I've seen this circulated throughout churches. I've actually seen it, the entire video performed in churches, or I've seen streaming of church services where they've performed the whole thing. But I really want to talk through this because personally, I think that this quote unquote church parody is representative of a lot of what's happening in the church. And I want to explain why I think that there's some of this where it may not actually be parody. Now, I'm not making an argument against the people that created the wrong worship church parody. I'm not trying to undermine how they've established that they believe this is a parody. What I want to do is more just for illustration purposes, explain why it may be a parody and why it may not be a parody, and just sort of highlight the differences. Ultimately, I think we need to understand that there is a distinction between what is parody or satire under copyright law for the purpose of getting yourself out of a infringement case, versus generic parody, generic satire, which may or may not land you in court, but it still fits the definition. I think that is one critical distinction. So let's watch a little bit of this, and I want to kind of talk through it. So I'll probably start and stop a little bit just to explain my thoughts on some of what's happening. So for context, if you've never watched this, basically we have a group of people on what looks like a church stage, and they appear to be playing worship songs, but once you start listening, I think you'll know what's going on, and we will talk through it. Here we go. Sing of your love on Sundays. Only sing of So I could sing of your love forever versus I will sing of your love on Sundays. I could sing of your love forever. I will sing of your love on Sundays. The obvious contrast being, people are singing forever about Jesus and about God's love, and yet if we, critically analyze what most Christians are doing, we might say, well, they're only singing about God's love on Sundays. That's the comedic part. That's the ridicule portion. So let's watch a little bit more of what's happening, and we'll talk more through it. I will sing of your love song. I surrender some. Jesus, I will give you little. So, I surrender all versus I surrender some. Jesus, I'll surrender all to you versus Jesus, I'll surrender a little bit to you. So again, it's funny. It's ridiculing how it's mocking how so many of us as Christians live, and legitimately looks like parody, legitimately looks like the point is to kind of capture bits and pieces of these worship songs, and change up the lyrics to where we can make fun of Christians and Christianities in a fun sort of way. But I think the comment and the criticism is well intended and probably even well received, in the sense that how many of us have sat in our church and thought, am I really giving God everything? And here's this guy up there singing, I'll give you some, I'll give you a little bit, not everything. So I think the message is clearly intended to evoke that emotion, to sort of comment and criticize, that. But let's move on a couple more pieces of this, and then I want to really hit home some points I want to make. How great is this song? Sing how great this song. So in this one, we're talking about how great is our God versus how great is this song. And the obvious commentary there, criticism there being how much we may focus on the performances and the slickness of our worship team, or the lighting, or things like that, as opposed to what we're actually singing about, which is God. So this is great stuff from a standpoint of communicating the idea. I think they really do a great job of hitting these points home. Let's just do maybe one or two more, and take it, wrap it up. I don't mean it, and I just go through the motions. Lift up your hands. So, like with the other songs, so we'll probably stop here because I think the point is well illustrated, is that, this version is that I will just go through the motions. And of course, the worship song talking about I will do it with all my heart. And this point in what is called the wrong worship, a church parody, I really want to hit a point home. So we're going to have to go back to the slides. Let me stop here, get back to a slide, because I want to illustrate a couple of points so we can wrap this thing up. As a lawyer, it's important for me to kind of always go back to statutes and case law when I want to assess whether something constitutes a parody or not. I always go back to the source, which is the law. And I have this back up on screen, which is the U.S. Supreme Court's language from the Two Live Crew Roy Orbison case. And let me read it to you again, because I think you're really going to understand what I'm trying to say now. Is the use of a parody is the use of some elements of a prior author's composition to create a new one that at least in part comments on that author's works. Now, think about this, okay? Earlier we talked about, the definition of a parody is an imitation of an artist or a work for comedic effect or ridicule. And we have this Supreme Court language that says that it's some elements of an old one to create a new one that comments on that author's. Now let me ask you this. Did the worship, the wrong worship song or medley, as we might call it, because one thing I do want to point out is it was some elements. none of those were complete songs. They were maybe 10 to 20-second sections, and they obviously weren't copies. They may have been substantially similar, but they weren't copies. But they were none of the entire songs, none of the original songs were used in their entirety, right? It was just some elements. So I think from the parody definition that the Supreme Court set forth, that element is met. And it's in order to create a new one. So not only did the wrong worship people use only a portion of the original song, they actually used a portion of, I don't know, maybe 7 songs, and they formed one medley, one complete song that was kind of incorporated pieces of all of those songs. So they certainly created a new one. But here's where I'm concerned. What was the comment on the original author's work? Now think about it. You know, when we talked earlier about the definition of a parody and we said it's an imitation, what is it an imitation of? An artist or a work? And going back to the U.S. Supreme Court issue where it says it comments on that author's works, I think we could add to that it comments on that author and or that author's works. Now think back to the Two Live Crew Roy Orbison, where there was actually commentary or criticism, I guess you could say, on the words. So it's the author's work in that instance because we weren't comparing videos at that point. But in the Uptown Funk comparison, we looked at the Mark Ronson, Bruno Mars version, and then we looked at the parody version, and we saw criticism both in the author, and this may not be technically accurate because Mark Ronson and Bruno Mars may not be legally considered the authors, but from the public perception perspective, they'd be treated as the authors. So there was commentary criticism on them as authors, like, you know, Bruno Mars dancing around looking cool in what he's wearing, and in the parody they're kind of making fun of him and everybody else on the set. So that's one aspect, that's one attribute, and that in the definition of parody is an imitation of the artist. And then the work itself, which in the song lyrics, that's what the commentary was there as well. Now, I challenge you as you think about it as a church or ministry organization, in that video, the last video we watched, where was the comment on each of the author's works that were imitated? Because if you think about it, you know, I surrender all versus I surrender some. Was that reference ridiculing or creating comedy as against the songwriter of I Surrender All? I don't think any of us, and I certainly don't think that the creators of it would say yes. In fact, I'm sure that they wouldn't have wanted to ridicule the songwriter of I Surrender All. So if it wasn't on the work itself, or it wasn't on the person, was it on the work itself? So are we as Christians now going to ridicule worship songs? No, I don't think that's what was intended. I don't think any reasonable person would say that's what was going on either. My opinion, what I think was happening, and this is my opinion, no judge has told me this is just me as an intellectual property attorney speculating about what I think the motivations were and how I might assess it. But again, this is not legal analysis, this is information. But me looking at that, I say, you know, actually they weren't commenting on or criticizing the substance of the original work or the author of the original work at all. What they were trying to do was ridicule the church environment and ridicule Christianity in general. Now, as I look at the definition set forth by the Supreme Court, I don't see where that meshes. I don't see where that lines up with the definition of a parody because there's no connection between what the artists in the parody, in the church parody, were doing. There's no connection, a criticism back to the people or the works of the originals. It's actually a larger criticism of Christianity. Now, the reason why I have concerns with that is because there was a case where somebody used some of the Cat in the Hat. And I don't remember all the details, but what the court determined was just because it was funny, what the author was really trying to do was leverage the value of the Cat in the Hat and Dr. Seuss in general for its own commercial benefit. Now, there were commercial attributes of that use. There are a lot of different facts that played in that do not apply in this wrong worship video. And I'm not saying that the same would apply even if all the elements were lined up. Simply because, here's another piece of this, simply because the U.S. Supreme Court determined that this is the definition, it's not like they could have, could not later distinguish and say, well, it can also be a larger societal criticism or a market criticism or a religious group criticism. So they may easily say, and by they I mean the U.S. Supreme Court, might easily say in a later case, well, yes, parody also includes criticizing, using an original author's work to criticize a broader segment of the population that has some relation or bearing on that original copyright. So I know this might sound a little bit like this is a little heady, trying to make sense of it. My point here is this. As a church or ministry organization, when you are considering parody work, one of the foundational legal components of that, there's a few, let me lay them out as it's stated already, that you use some elements, not all of it. So you shouldn't be using entire songs, entire films, entire transcripts, entire books, entire articles, entire pictures. To the extent possible, you should never be using the entire original work. That's sort of element number one. Element number two being that there's a new work created. And this is what courts would really look at, and you'll hear the term transformative kicked around in any discussion relating to parody or fair use in general. It's a transformative use. The courts care that this is not serving the same function. So if we listen to the Roy Orbison version of a song, the Two Live Crew clearly does not serve the same function as the Roy Orbison song. And in the church parody, we might say, well, these versions, the parody versions, clearly do not serve the same purpose as the original worship songs. Obviously, I don't think anybody would disagree with. But the final component, the big one, where churches really need to be careful and ministry organizations really need to be careful, is that you need to find a way to comment on or criticize the original work that you are borrowing from. This is the biggest piece I see missing in nearly every single parody scenario that I look at with churches, and I look at these all the time. I'm routinely retained to look at videos and segments of services that have been recorded and all kinds of different materials. Brock, is this a parody? Does this constitute a parody? And I could tell you that a vast majority of materials that I review for churches and ministry organizations where the question is whether or not it constitutes a parody, where I've actually been retained to give legal analysis and legal opinion. The opinion boils down to there was no relation to what you did, any relation from that back to the original. There might have been a bigger commentary on society or a bigger commentary on Christianity, but that's just a big missing piece that I see. So I think that will make sense for you. So I'm going to wind it down with that. You know, as you look at parodies, parodies are supposed to be insulting. A lot of times they can be ridiculing somebody or something. That's not what we have a problem with. If people don't want to buy a song or a film, or they boycott something because you've made fun of them with a parody, that's okay from a copyright perspective. The bigger issue is how you've used the original, the extent that you've used it, your purpose and character of use, and there's always this balancing act that goes into this, so that's why it's a case-by-case analysis. So I hope this makes sense. I hope this helps you better understand parodies. And if you are struggling with parodies, if you're struggling with understanding fair use in general, copyright use in your church, please reach out. Here's my contact information. You can reach out to me by email. You can reach out to me through the website contact form, but reach out. This is stuff that I care about. This is stuff that I'm passionate about, the topics, and also working with churches and ministries. So if you find yourself struggling with these issues, reach out, get some professional answers on how you're doing it. But otherwise, this was intended to provide you with general training, general information, sort of a framework for understanding parodies in the church. And I hope it's done that for you. Thank you so much, and I wish you the best.